combining all those things kind of came together, and I go, Japanese gardens and well-being, there's a lot being talked about. So well-being, just to give us a quick overview, it does these things. The one thing I would point out, oh, by the way, if anybody for some reason wants a copy of this presentation, just write that down and I'll send it to you. So don't worry about taking notes, but most of you are. So the one thing I want to emphasize is well-being. I think it's sort of like self-esteem, where people think about it as something you either have or you don't have. Sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. But what I want to emphasize is well-being is not something kind of you're born with or that happens at certain times. It involves certain attitudes and ways that you look at the world and the way you act or behave, and certain skills that you use. So that's a good thing because we can all improve on our well-being skills. I want to talk a little bit, just say a few things about challenges. Let me back up for a second and say some of the things that I'm going to present, if you've been around the garden, you're going to be familiar with what I'm talking about. But I think maybe I get a little different angle on the reason for the elements, the reason for the design, from a psychology. I'm really fascinated in how, and you'll see me talk about a couple of places, how neuroscience, the latest research on brain research, in my mind is substantiating 1,500 years of history in Japanese garden design. It's like, that's really fascinating to me. And again, it's second nature, but challenges to well-being. I used to, as a family therapist, give a lot of talks because I always felt like if I could talk, I did families with adolescents, like I said, if I could educate them, maybe they wouldn't end up seeing me. And I'd always get several of the same questions, and one of the questions you'd always hear is, don't you think kids have it worse than they ever did before? And I was giving these talks in the 90s to the 20 teens, right? And I'd say no. My pat answer was always no. Kids need an adult that's there for them, a loving adult that shows them that they love them, they care about them, and holds them accountable. As I went along, I started to say, but we don't know the influence of cell phones and technology. We don't know what that is. Now I can say we do know, unfortunately, because I wondered about brain development in young kids using technology, and I would try to read things, and I couldn't find it. Now you can find it, and unfortunately it's not good news. In fact, there's a book that just came out, I think it's Jonathan Haidt, who's a really good writer, called The Anxious Generation. And he's come out, he's got the best sort of overview of mental health related to kids and technology, cell phone technology. And his conclusion is we should not allow kids until they're in high school to have smartphones. And so that you're going to hear a lot more about that because this has just come out. But so now I say, now we do know that the research of technology has had a major impact on the ability of people to focus attention. Okay. And you can see the problems with that, stress-related, multitasking, all these kinds of things. Okay, so I see three challenges. One, difficulties focusing attention. If you look at the statistics now, I still read things even though I'm long retired on adolescents, and it's sad and disappointing. The level of depression and anxiety in young people has gone up at like 20%. And as I said, Jonathan Haidt is correlating it to the use of cell phones. And a lot of it has to do with social media, the fear of missing out, so that I'm focused on the media all the time and I'm losing the skills and ability to interact with people in person. and also it's natural for us to make comparisons of ourselves to other people, except it just magnifies it. This has nothing to do with cell phone technology, but in my years as a therapist, I saw this over and very frequently as a problem. And that ruminating thinking is the idea of cycling over and over and over again. And so you can either focus on past, and I sort of just developed this idea on my own, because you often saw people with depression. Now I won't get into it too much, but there's sort of, in my mind, biological depression, people that are born with that struggle with it throughout their life. But my work was with adolescents who was more of a situational kind of depression, so just to kind of give you that context. And in those cases, they tended to focus over again, and it's why me, why everything, and why always, and your answers are always negative. So you're just cycling over and over, it's a normal thing to try to make sense of the events of our lives, but if you get caught in ruminating thinking, it becomes a negative. The flip side, if you're looking out to the future, if you want to create a sense of anxiety, you say, what if this happens? So if I'm standing here, my biggest fear of public speaking is, what if I forget what I'm going to say? What am I going to do then? So what if? And so normal thing with public speaking is to feel anxious. So ruminating thinking. So some of the challenges, so I want to take my ideas around some of the challenges and why are Japanese gardens so beneficial for well-being and mental health. Now, one thing I found out in the 90s, the first research came out, I remember, at least I read it, for depression, they were doing studies to show, hey, if you get people out walking outside, it reduces depression. I'm fascinated, so I'm reading this again in the context 30 years ago, and I'm reading this, and it showed that walking outside was as effective as antidepressants. Okay, you didn't read that a lot because you can't sell that, is my cynical thing on that. But I started using it in my work, and I had some families where the folks did not, I can prescribe medication, but people didn't want to, and we got them walking, and I had some fantastic results from people walking. So much so, I would say to people, I'm gonna give you a prescription. Here's your prescription. I want you to walk 3 times this week, and then they come back and I go, I'm gonna double the dose. I want you to walk every day. And I want it to be for 20 minutes. Yes, sir.
Does it make a difference where you walk?
Yes, thank you. I was going there. Thank you. And feel free to comment. I appreciate that. There were studies that looked at walking in a gym versus walking in nature. Well, what's going to be more effective? Okay, we all know the answer to that, but why is it more effective? What do you think? Why is it more effective in nature?
Fresh air.
Fresh air, there's an aspect to it that you're getting health benefits, that's right. Other thoughts on?
It's more stimulating.
I'm sorry?
It's more stimulating.
In what way?
Taste, smell, feel, everything.
Yeah,
Vision.
other,
You got all your senses.
that's right.
That's
And-
how we
and-
were evolved to be.
Yes.
We were evolved to be in nature.
Yes, and yes, absolutely, absolutely. So nature is a therapeutic place, is one way I think of it as a therapist, for those very reasons. And I often hear Japanese gardens are nature therapy, okay? Or they're therapeutic because they're a natural environment. That's true, but that really bothers me, okay? Because, again, I worked in the Park Service. I've been in parks. Being in a park can be a therapeutic experience, but in my mind, it's no comparison to a Japanese garden, right? A Japanese garden, and so what about it? So then that started me on a path is, I just know it has to be more therapeutic. what are the aspects of a Japanese garden that makes it more therapeutic, right, than nature? So we need to think about in a little different way. And there are some programs, people that I worked with on the panel that took the experience in nature, and that's all well and good, but I think we can use the aspects of Japanese gardens more effectively, okay? And I think some of it is, when I show you some of that, some of my thoughts on it, you'll go, well, of course. But we have to remember that it's not just because it's nature, it's because it's a Japanese garden and all these components to it, okay? What makes them unique? I took a definition from Koichi Kobayashi, and he was at the conference. I said, I stole your thing and I modified it a little bit. He said, okay. So I was trying to look at, I'm starting at a basic thing. Again, I'm just looking at it as a student, and I'm going, hey, what is it about a garden? Well, first I gotta know a definition of the Japanese garden, and this is the best one I could find. And that got me to thinking about it. So works of living landscape art, well, there's lots of those. Aesthetic values, all gardens are created and maintained by aesthetic values. All gardens have something to do with natural scenery and processes. And all gardens give you a sense of connection to nature, hopefully a sense of serenity and well-being. But I think it's the aesthetic values contained in a Japanese garden that give us ways of seeing, attitudes, lessons, practices, and well-being. That's my theory anyway. So you see if when I get done you agree with me or not. But, so we can't, it's not just nature, it's not just gardens, there's much more, as you folks all know, to a Japanese garden than being a natural area and being a garden. So being a National Park Service person, I know the history of national parks. In fact, in 2016, I had to do a lot of presentations for the Park Service, which got me thinking, when I saw this definition on landscape art, our parks in the country were really established because of artists, right? This is Hudson River School, and they didn't have a way to communicate, so they paint these massive landscape paintings, and they'd take them to Washington, and that's how we got Yosemite and Yellowstone and those. So I started thinking about, well, what are the values that we see in landscape art in this country versus Japan? Because Japanese gardens are based on landscape art principles too. And again, there's people in here that probably know more about this than I do. Add to my discussion, that's fine. So when you see that, it gives you a certain sense about nature and our connection to nature. I mean, what's your first reaction when you see a picture like that? If we could have, I mean, the true one is in Congress, and it's about this big as a screen.
I feel
Exactly, awe, she said, awe. Yes,
I want to go there.
okay. Other reactions?
There's also a sense of otherness, this majesty, this almost a divine
Yes,
feeling.
and that was part of it, the way they painted it with the light and
The light.
the sense of sort of a spiritual thing and awe. There was a term at the time called sublime and picturesque, okay, which is a way to measure the value of a landscape. And I think they painted in that way because that was the cultural, beauty was sort of defined in, is it a sublime landscape, is it picturesque? And there's actually a philosophy written on how you measure. And if you think about awe and you think about the things picturesque, what does that tell us about our connection with nature? I'm asking you guys.
Well, I think the spirituality of it, and I also am reminded that I'm nature,
Okay,
that I belong there.
Now, I'm gonna disagree, because when I see a thing like this, because I worked at the Grand Canyon as a volunteer for a month. I lived out at on the North Rim, and I loved it because there were 7 million people on the other side, and where I was had 10,000 all year. And I had 5 days, I was on the Grand Canyon by myself as a backcountry ranger. I could go out every day and I didn't see anybody for 5 days. And my experience looking over the side was awe and fear.
Yeah.
So I think there's an aspect to that in my mind to it that's a little bit different. And we talked about that. Now let's compare, anyway, you can toy with that idea. Oh, so I toy with the idea of, okay, well, if we have that in our culture, then what are we seeing now with how we look at nature? And this is a relatively new phenomenon. It used to be the picturesque that I mentioned in the 1800s and those pictures of nature. And then you folks I can see are in my range, and then we had the Kodak moment for nature, right? What was the Kodak moment? I think everybody knows that. That was sort of like a family spot where you're showing your family with nature. But now I'm worried because we have the selfie. And when I go to parks, what I see when I observe people at the edge of the Grand Canyon, mostly younger people, is they're all doing it. And jumping up and down and doing stuff like that. And where's the nature?
Background.
And I don't even think it's in the background. It's the whole purpose is to show yourself in a certain setting. So I get concerned about that. And I think it's a new phenomenon. As I said. Now let's compare the Western to the Eastern. Seshu, I believe, was 1200. Thomas Moran was mid-1800s. But what kind of values are we seeing? What's the difference between that image and what we saw on the Yosemite? What's your first reaction? Any comments? Yeah.
Peace.
Peace, okay. Other comments?
To me, it almost looks like this is a
Easy
Western
scale.
perspective, but like a fairy tale, like, I'm in a forest where I don't know what's coming.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a
More
fairy tale.
intimate.
I'm sorry?
It's a little more intimate.
Intimate.
Yeah.
Yeah, say more about that, would you?
Well, I mean, the other one was so huge and overwhelming, and this is just this quiet little peaceful spot where you can sit and contemplate the delicacy and the intricacy of the setting.
I agree. We'll talk about it a little bit, and it draws you in. There's certain aesthetic values which I'll talk about from Shinto. We're just going to do a brief overview of a bunch of things, but I like what you said. It draws you in, or to me, it immerses you, it brings you into the feeling of it, which is a basic result of cultural things from Japan, why the Japanese garden. Anyway, just to give you an idea. So those are landscape art. Now in my definition, we're going to look at just a quick overview of some of the underlying basic things that are contained that are more spiritual values in a Japanese garden. And I love the idea that the Shinto is an area that's marked off with gravel. That's a place to be in touch with the kami spirit. And again, I'm just doing a quick overview of that. And so we certainly see that in Japanese gardens, the gravel, the sense of the essence. The way in Taoism, nature is here to teach us lessons if we're observant enough to follow and focus on the lessons of nature. So that, once again, is drawing us in as opposed to stepping back and looking at it from a distance. It's where I got the idea of Niwado as the way. The way of tea, I think we should have the way of the garden, which is kind of what I'm promoting. Niwado is not a term I came up with. There was a book, Norris Brock Johnson coined the phrase that I know the first time I saw it, the way of the garden. And so I'm trying to say, you need to look at the garden as another way of cultivating life, well-being. Finding truth in the everyday experiences is a value. And you can read these. I'll say more about these. Oh, by the way, the pictures, I'm really happy, are ones I took in, all of them in Japan. And the previous, this is Robert Ketchel of England, who's a wonderful, he's doing his last tour in April of next year, I think. So what's the Eastern experience of nature? We had the selfie, and I think you said it back there, it's more of a personal, contemplative, an observation. It's a whole different realm. Okay, originally I thought of Japanese gardens, as I said, as a restorative space. Restoring your attention, the first thing that grabbed me was the focus of attention. And you all know that when you're in a Japanese garden, it has an impact on you, and I think most of you, that what would you say is the feeling you come away with from an experience in the garden? What's a word? I'm sorry?
Peaceful.
Peaceful, other, tranquil, calm,
Happy.
happy. And so all I'm saying here is there are certain characteristics of a garden that create that we all know. So we want to make sure we know what that is. So it's these things. It takes us away from and there's a theory for that. And it's another thing, the rich features to me, when I first went into the first garden, it's just fascinating because it was so unique. I don't understand it at all, and yet we all share that same kind of common feeling as a result of it. So it's a restorative place to be just by the nature of its design, much more so than nature in itself. Nature can be kind of brutal. Here's some of the idea. I like the idea. It's funny, as a therapist, therapy's not something that you ever want to come to, right? And when I had adolescents, parents would always say, you didn't want to come here. I go, if you wanted to come here, there's something wrong with them. Because nobody wants to come to see somebody they don't know and talk about personal things, especially not males, who I worked with, was adolescent males. But I tried to create a therapeutic setting. When you walked in my door, I'd say to people, this is a space like no other space you've been in. And I hope that you'll find very soon that it's a space of comfort and a feeling of safety where we listen to each other and respect each other and pay attention. And so I was struck by how this same thing happens in the Japanese garden. We have a gate that you walk into and you enter into a space that's unlike any other space that you know of. And it's always defined by it. It's this feeling of safety because normally there's a garden or there's hedges or something, and so those things are analogous. And once you're in there, it's a feeling of immersion in space. So I want to look at some of the aspects of a Japanese garden and the lessons that we can learn. And again, I think these are things that are really familiar to you folks. The garden path. So what I try to do is come up with kind of what are the lessons and what are the steps and real basic terms, what would the way be from a Japanese garden for well-being? And so my idea is to say, what are the lessons from different aspects of the garden? What do they teach us? Niwado, first, slow down. And then from research, what do we know are those skills or practices that can help us to become more healthy and happy? And then it contrasts with the distractions that we all face in life. So. Ma, I think most people are familiar with. What do you folks know? It's wonderful talking to an audience that knows things. What do you know about Ma?
Space.
Space? What kind of space?
Quiet space.
Quiet space, she said. Other people?
It's welcoming.
Welcoming. In what way?
Well, I think it draws you in so that you feel like you belong, rather.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. I was talking at the Najka conference at Tim, and I had a person in the panel. This was the workshop you guys were not in the morning, and he was a painter, and he represented a museum in California. And I'm like, hey, you know. And he started talking. He goes, "Well, we call it negative space in painting." And I said, "That's interesting because it has a negative," which I knew nothing about. I'm not a painter or an artist, but and I also, or empty space. And I think in our culture we think of empty as a negative thing, but not. Ma is not. It's the opposite.
Positive space, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
Ma is a positive
Yes.
space.
Exactly, but I'm saying, I think it's a cultural difference between the culture I grew up in, and I think, I hear it, when I first heard it, as a negative thing, it's empty. And,
I like to explain it as, you know, if you've ever laid on the grass under a tree and you look up and you see the leaves and the light is dappling through, which I love that experience. Ma is the light, the spaces between the leaves, the sky beyond. It's the different space. It's the space we tend not to perceive first.
the kanji character is a doorway, as I understand it, being filled by sunlight. To fill the space. The beauty of it is, Ma allows us to fill the space. And, oh, here it is. I was at Ryanchi, you're familiar with that, classic, and I thought, I don't know if I'll like the dry gardens, because I've used to stroll gardens in the United States. I got here and I sat down and and it's such a perfect example of Ma, because I remember my reaction going, oh, what is this about? Mentally, I'm kind of working at, what is this about? And these are islands, and this is water, and that's waves. And then, it's a beautiful sound. It's better than a ding, 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 dong. That's okay. Okay. And so to me, it was a perfect experience for me, because then it changed from sort of these rational, trying to figure it out. I was struck by how I just sat down. It was crowded, and I sat down, and there was nobody else in my mind around me.
Wow.
And yet it was people everywhere.
That's right. That's the
And
question
I go,
was
this
asked.
just pulled me into this space, and then I sort of let go of the mental process of what does this mean? And I looked at the texture of the rocks, the texture of the moss, and you know what I came away with more than anything? The coloration of the wall. That's what and I think the wall's 600 or 700 years old, and I forgot the technique. And I go, let's say 500, 600, 700, 800 years worth of moss and stain. That's what I came with. To me, that's an experience of Ma. It draws you in, it just totally, you stop and you're taken in by the experience. There's also transitional things I think are somewhat experiences of Ma, maybe more bridges, are an in-between space where we can look back and look forward or just look. But I love the idea of Ma. And I just recently read this. You have to know it. This is a side thing. My wife is a classical. She was a flute teacher in a classical. She played flute, classical flute. And so we go to lots of live concerts, right? And boy, does she get upset at a concert when they clap between movements. Where do these people hadn't learned this, you know? And I get, you know, it's like, well, they're excited. There is brain research, okay, where they put people in MRI, functional fMRI machines, right? And they're playing classical music, and I tried to get a cut to show you, but I couldn't figure out the technology to show you, where they have a video of a person listening to Beethoven, and they use Bach, and they use other classical forms of music, composers. And they do a left and a right side brain, and it's a live image, right? And guess where the brain lights up the most? In the space between the movements. Not during the music.
The gap.
Because if I could show this graph, see, I got Tim's attention. If I could show you this graphically, it just blows your mind. And why is that? So I think the thinking is the space, I've listened to this whole movement of Beethoven, and now I have the space, and I take it all in. And I'm aware of my senses, and my reaction, and my perceptions to the space. So the neuroscience, and this is stuff that came out in the last couple of years, is proving, I think, what the Japanese culture knew for some reason, somehow, and they created. So we need spaces, and I call it the power of pause. So we need to slow down, pause, and these are things we can, and look again, and what it does is it gives us a chance to process things, you know, we're so busy and so, anyway. But isn't that why I love the neuroscience of Ma? Okay, so, in addition to them being restorative spaces, I think of Japanese spaces as therapeutic, and here's my definition of that. So in therapy, you know, you can do your own therapy if you come into the space and you reflect on your thought, you reflect on yourself. You know, part of therapy is going through all this thing, but reflecting on yourself and your experiences, hopefully with the idea of getting new perspectives, and in my case, changing behaviors, but new skills of being with yourself and others. So I think Japanese gardens are restorative. They reduce stress just by their attention, but they also teach us skills that become therapeutic. Now, how do you get to be a space that's reflective? I'm just checking the time here, we're getting pretty good. This is another little aspect of neuroscience of beauty, or neuroaesthetics. There's a new book out, it's been out for a year, Your Brain on Music, neuroaesthetics. Some new, where we're looking at, again, they're putting people in machines and they're showing them pictures of things. And again, so they did it with nature and natural scenes. And so I think it goes back to, we're part of nature. You know, we evolved in nature, that you said before, sir. But here's some of the neuroscience of beauty. What we define as beauty has these characteristics. Okay, this is the Adachi where John Powell trained. Pictures of that. So landscape layers. So if we have these elements that I'm going to show you on the right, then we'll perceive it as beautiful. sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sticking with beauty, this is a couple other aesthetic values I'm throwing in related to beauty, wabi-sabi, that you all know. In the seeing beauty in the everyday, which is not so much part of our culture. Beauty is something like adornment in our culture or anything that's of value. Okay, so my third step in the way to well-being is to contemplate beauty in the everyday experiences. And why is that so important? Remember my thing when I first talked about the 3 challenges to well-being and ruminating thinking, okay? Ruminating thinking, the problem is you're stuck in this self-identified, I'm all focused within myself. Beauty does, if we perceive something as beautiful, it pulls us out of ourselves. It pulls us out of ourselves in a way, and we can step back from and be more reflective. So it creates a sense of reflection, and we can step back from the day-to-day problems. Beauty is also, there's just a natural sense that draws us in or connects us to something we perceive, whether it's an object or a landscape of beauty. And it usually results in us feeling a sense of hopefulness, beauty and hopefulness, by its very nature. Mono no aware, you familiar with that? The cherry blossom? You folks know, why is the cherry blossom revered in Japan?
It's so ephemeral.
I heard that it was one of the shortest blossom periods. It's so ephemeral. And I love that idea of the beauty matched. And I'm trying to think, can anybody, I can't think of a term that it's beauty plus sadness.
Say it again, please.
Beauty and sadness
Yes.
at the impermanence of it. You would agree with that? Can anybody think of a term that we have similar? I can think of poignancy, which is sadness, but it doesn't connote beauty. Yeah, but I don't hear the sense of beauty and appreciation. I know, I've been wrestling with this one, that's why I'm asking.
That's the Japanese aesthetic, isn't it?
Yes,
It's almost
and I'm,
forlorn, where there's a yearning but a sadness at the same time.
would you agree with that?
Forlorn?
Because you won't stay long.
No.
You see the beauty, but you know at the same time.
You wanna hold
it
on to
comes
it.
down. So you see beauty at the same time.
Yes. And it has some other, that aesthetic or way of seeing, which I'll get to in a slide or two, connects to some principles of well-being in a really nice way. Okay. Well, actually, we have it here, gratitude and appreciation. Gratitude, being grateful for the fact that you have the opportunity to see and experience it. And gratitude, they know from research, if there's activities people give for well-being, write 3 things you're grateful for every day at the end of the day. Has a tremendous effect on people's well-being. Yes, sir?
Well, bittersweet.
That's as close as yeah. Yeah, bittersweet, because there's a, yeah. Often associated with tea gatherings, ichigo, ichi-e. A reminder that this time is the one time and the only time that we have together. In the tea ceremony, it's certainly really vital. So my 4th step from those aesthetics is a reflection. We're now we went from contemplating the beauty outside ourselves to reflecting back to ourselves from a different perspective. We've gone outside of ourselves back to it. And we're more likely to be curious about, one of the best things I could do in therapy is to get somebody outside of themselves and and I would say to kids, because I had adolescents, right, I'd say, if we were making a movie of what you're talking about, what would the movie look like? That was just a technique, because I was trying to get them out of seeing, but to see themselves in a different view from an outside point of view, right? Well, I see myself doing this and that and that. Well, beauty does the same thing. And the other aesthetics get us to look inside and savor the present moment. Okay, focus and savor, and with a feeling of gratitude. Here's one, I think Tim heard me talk a little bit about this. It's a new one, and I put it up here because it's so new to me, I don't get it yet. And I gotta tell you a story, I think I got time. Yeah, one of the gardens I work at, we had a tour one time, and I don't do the tours, like I said, I'm working with the gardener, and we have a tour come in, a horticultural group, and I noticed this one guy, so I'm at a tree helping candle or something, and I see this guy in the back, and I go, this guy has no interest in being here whatsoever. So my adolescent history, I go, well, I'm interested in this guy. He's not interested, so I'm like, so I just start walking around with this guy, and I just walk around with him. I'm not gonna tell him anything, and we walk all the way around. It's a stroll garden, and he goes, you know, I didn't say anything the whole time, and he didn't ask me any questions, and I already told you what my perception, he didn't want to be there, his wife drug him there, and he goes, you know, I didn't want to be here, my wife drugged me this. I said, oh yeah, I kind of thought that. And he goes, but you know, I've never been in a Japanese garden before, and I don't know anything about them, but I really like something I saw here. He goes, I have never been in a garden or a space so well maintained before. And I really appreciate the care that must go into this garden. And then another story, we have this hillside with about 30 pine trees, and it's probably what I consider our best spot in this garden, where you sit and you look across the hillside and you have this one scene. And it, you know, I'm a little slow, it took me a couple of years, but people say, you know, ask about the pine trees. And I didn't realize what they're saying is, where can I buy a pine tree like that? What species is that? You know, and I go, well, it's this, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I went, duh, the light went off. I go, well, you could buy a pine tree like this, but it's gonna take 50 years before, because our trees have been pruned and candled and cared for 50 years. And they're like, their jaws drop. I go, see what we do, you know, it takes 2 guys on this one tree all day to do this. And so I'm really fascinated by, I put this up, the aesthetic of caring. I think there's a connection because of what that guy taught me. He reacted in a positive way, and we all want to be cared for, I think. And I, honest to God, I put it up because, oops, uh-oh, something's happened here, not happening. Uh-oh, I'm jammed up. I don't understand it. I mean, I don't understand how we can use it, but I think it's really important. Well, Tim, what do we do now? Oh, I have a couple slides
Can we
left.
have full manual?
Yeah, are you the tech guy?
Well, no.
I know you're not. Wait a minute, I could try my clicker. Slide, we could do it this way.
Oh, there you
Oh,
go.
something's, okay,
All right,
okay,
these are it.
okay.
Good job, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. You're the man. So anyway, I just put that up, it's something I'm playing with. How does it relate to well-being, and how can we educate the public about it as a value of Japanese garden? Okay, just a quick overview, and then I'll wrap up here. there's a well-known group in Madison that studies well-being. They really started from a meditation standpoint, and they do all the work on neuroscience. I forget the name of the group, that's terrible. And they came up with this overview. There's 4 basic things we need for well-being. And so all I'm saying is, if you look at what we're talking about and what happens in a Japanese garden, it fits with neuroscience. We need to have these things, focus on the present moment, blah, blah, blah. So I won't go through and read them. We need to have positive connections, so we learned from the very beginning that nature and connection is a part of the Japanese garden. Insight comes from reflection. So if we're have an experience in a garden, and we can reflect and see ourselves. I know, I forget who was talking to me, who's a docent here, was talking about what do you do when people come into a garden for grieving. And I won't get into that, I had some ideas on that, but it's a safe place, that's why people come to, they'll do it in parks too, but it also gives you a spot to reflect on your grief and your grieving experience. And on reflection, purpose, we know purpose is really important in neuroscience. So here's there is a movement right at the end when I retired from the Park Service in 2016. There was a group out of California that was prescription for parks, healthy, healthy people. And it's taken off. There are now prescriptions for museums. And so my thought is, and I'm involved in the North American Japanese Garden Association, I'm trying to push them for Japanese gardens for well-being. Would be events that would happen in gardens or in their group, and the focus would be, there's so many gardens doing it. Anderson's doing tons of work on well-being, but to get it out on a broader level, the value of it. So one of my ideas is you could have discover your place in the garden. And because of the gardens I'm in weekly, I have 2 gardens I go into every week. I have my place, and I have the fortunate ability to go every week and spend some time in that place. And so we would just to highlight this would be my prescription. And I think I gotta tie my shoe or I'm gonna trip and that'd be embarrassing. Excuse me. I think if the practices that are contained in the lessons in a Japanese garden, especially from the aesthetics that we talked about, these are practices we can use in any environment. And that's a really good thing. You want to be able to transfer skills from one place to your normal one. So. No, it's not. So I'll end with that statement. Yes, sir.
Now I visited lots of Japanese gardens, you work in one. Now somebody who works I'm a gardener, I spend a lot of time in the garden, well, me, myself, my
At home.
They're at home. And then it's a vegetable garden mostly, I try
Yep.
to grow some wildflowers, and it's my church.
Yeah.
Now, somebody, do you get the same benefit of just visiting a place or actually working?
Oh, that's a good one. I'd say there'd be more depth to working, that's, just off the top of my head. Because there's a greater sense of connection to it. And, yeah, I don't know, I don't have any research. You have a comment on it? You're just in agreement?
Yeah, I agree, you're participating in
Yeah.
it rather than just observing it,
Yeah.
and taking responsibility and credit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You
So
get-
I have
Yes,
a
sir.
question. You've been to Rockford at least 6 to 8 times.
Yeah,
or whatever.
exactly.
Have you ever been out to Rosecrans?
No, I haven't, but I have a possible invitation to go.
Yeah.
I
mean,
know
that's-
all about Rosecrans
Okay,
because of
okay, yeah.
adolescence in the garden.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah,
stroll garden basically out there, and I just,
yeah.
if you had been there, I was gonna ask what your thought was, how this would be helping with, you know, working with adolescents.
Well, I think they're probably doing a fantastic job, and
Yeah.
Catherine could maybe speak to that, because she works on it. Are you interested in what they're doing?
Well, I just thought, I mean, since you're here, you could go tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's part of the plan, if I have
Yeah,
time.
okay.
Thank you for the,
And we actually have a relationship with Rosecrans.
Yeah.
And Catherine spearheads that
Yeah.
effort.
And Hoichi
So real quickly.
designed, right, out
Yeah.
there?
Luigi designed that garden,
Yeah,
yeah, and the Andersons funded a great deal of that garden. So Catherine, a little bit about what we do with Rosecrans?
So this year marks 10 years of our collaboration with Rosecrans. The adolescents will come once a week. We have a 2-hour program. It involves a 30-minute tour, 1 hour working in the garden, 10-minute meditation, 10 minutes about connection to nature, and then we feed the fish at the end as a reward.
That's this cool.
That's in this garden, correct. And I do know bits of how they utilize their own space, they're at Rosecrans, but not a lot, so.
just off the top of my head, knowing adolescence, the one great thing you got, just really basic, is it's active.
Yeah.
I took kids outside, don't, come into my office and let's talk about it. So, I mean, just for starters,
Yeah.
it's hands-on, it's those informal things that happen that are powerful. So,
I have a friend who works at Rosecrans, a mutual friend, and she's the young people there call her the tea lady. And she does teas out in their garden, and that's a place of where she, getting that nature, getting that energy that's happening there. In that space, there's a space of further focus, connection, sharing, being a part of creating something, enjoying something together in community, and and also being still, and all the senses. But that's the power, the power of tea, but it's tea in the context of all these other elements that are just fine-tuned because of the space they're in.
Other comments, questions?
So I might just say that, talking about what the value of working in a garden versus just visiting the garden, and one thing that it feels sensible to me and right is that Ken Brown, professor of Asian art history, and probably seen more Japanese gardens than anyone who's ever lived. He says, as we nurture the garden nurtures us. And so so like the caring of a garden, and when kids come in and work in the garden, there's something, there might be apprehension up front, but often it's overcome by actually doing something good and caring for something. And so, yes, I think nurturing the garden yourself is important, but also Hoichi, this garden's designer, and Rosecrans as well, talks about the importance of keeping things clean and orderly and tidy. And he said that we illustrate our love for the garden by how we care for it with our hands. And when people come in, they can see that love, and they feel that appreciation that someone has for it, and that induces a kind of appreciation in them.
Yes, and I'm playing with the idea too of how do we instill that in our docent, when we talked and our tours, and that's a new thing. I agree with that. How do we bring that out to get people to see that?
We can work on that tomorrow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the ways I just ran into is to say, that took 50 years to make.
Yeah.
And they just like, what? They had no idea. It's funny, I have to tell a side story. Ken Brown, I saw him at the conference, and I said, and he's very informal, I said, Ken, I have a question to ask you. I said, how many gardens have you been to? And he goes, probably 1,000. That was what he told me. And I go, God. I mean, if he's like the guru in some ways to me, and I go, oh, because he came over to ask. Anyway, I said, well, I saw a tape, and I want to know if this is true, where you were asked, what's your most memorable garden experience, right? And without hesitation, and he goes, really, it's on tape? And I go, think about it, Ken. If I ask you that question, what's your most memorable experience? Here's a guy that's been all over the world, 1,000 gardens. He goes, oh, I know what I said. I go, what did you say? Because I got it on tape. And he said, I was in Lethbridge, Canada, at the something, I forget the name of the garden up there, and it was a Najka conference, and it was at dusk, and the moon was coming up and the sun was setting, and the person doing the tour told us to close our eyes, and it was all sensory, and he talked about all these sensory things, and I go, and he's, in my mind, he's an academic person, he's in the academic world, and I go, well, I just love the fact, I'm a therapist on the other side of the fence, that your most memorable experience is a sensory feeling perception. And I said, that's what we talk about in our education thing that we're gonna do tomorrow, is how do we create those kinds of experiences. So, anyway. I think we're done, thank you.